They say the most dangerous people are the ones you least expect. The quiet ones. The ones who don't look like a threat until it's too late. And tonight, in the middle of nowhere, a group of bikers was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The road stretched endlessly beneath the dark Arizona sky, the moon casting a faint glow over miles of empty highway. The only break in the silence was the rhythmic hum of an engine, a lone vehicle making its way through the vast open land. Sarah Monroe sat behind the wheel, one hand steady on the controls, her sharp blue eyes scanning the road ahead. She had been driving for hours, the kind of long, solitary drive that gave a person too much time to think. Not that she minded the quiet. After years of structured military life, followed by the chaos that came after, she had learned to appreciate solitude. But even solitude had its limits. And with her gas gauge inching toward empty, she had no choice but to stop. The gas station appeared on the horizon like a forgotten relic of the past. A single-story building with flickering neon lights, a rusted, old truck parked out front, and a lone attendant visible through the smudged glass windows. It was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still, the kind of stop where travelers refueled quickly and kept moving. Sarah pulled in and killed the engine. In the back of the van, her two service dogs, Ranger and Echo, remained still, their ears flicking slightly at the sound of the parking brake. To the untrained eye, they were nothing more than well-behaved companions, lying quietly as their handler prepared to step out. But Sarah knew better. She had trained them herself, after all. Sliding into her wheelchair, she moved with practiced ease, her prosthetic leg a silent reminder of another life, a past filled with long deployments, dangerous missions, and choices that couldn't be undone. She didn't dwell on it anymore. What was done was done. She positioned herself at the pump, listening to the slow trickle of gas as she filled her tank. The night was still, eerily quiet, save for the occasional chirp of crickets in the distance. Then she heard it. A low rumble, distant but unmistakable. Motorcycles. Her grip on the pump tightened slightly. There was nothing inherently threatening about motorcycles. This was a well-traveled highway after all. Riders passed through all the time. But something about the way these engines roared, the way the sound lingered in the air, it put her on edge. She didn't turn around right away. Instead, she let her instincts do the work, feeling the vibrations grow stronger, the engines slowing. As they neared the station, a quick glance toward the gas station attendant told her everything she needed to know. The old man had gone rigid behind the counter, his gaze shifting nervously toward the parking lot. Sarah exhaled slowly. This wasn't just another fuel stop, this was something else. Her dogs remained quiet in the van, but she knew they had already picked up on the shift in the atmosphere. They were waiting, just as she was, because tonight assumptions were about to be broken and someone was about to make a very big mistake. But now, let me ask you something. If you were in Sarah's position, what would you do? Would you ignore them and keep your head down, hoping to avoid trouble? Or would you stand your ground and remind them that they picked the wrong target? Maybe you'd do something else entirely. Let me know what you'd choose. And before we dive into what happens next, make sure to stick around, because trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming. The roar of the motorcycles settled into a deep, menacing idle as they pulled into the gas station, their headlights cutting harsh beams through the desert night. The riders moved in slow, calculated motions, their presence stretching out into the silence like a storm cloud rolling in. Their jackets bore the emblem of the Iron Vultures, a name that carried weight in places where the law didn't always reach. Sarah had heard of them. The name wasn't just whispered over bar stools in backwater towns, it carried real stories. Businesses burned to the ground when owners refused to pay. People who crossed their path simply disappeared. These weren't just bikers, They were something more organized, more methodical. They lived by a different set of rules, rules enforced by men who had seen combat, men who had learned how to turn violence into a business. A single bike pulled up closest to Sarah, stopping just a few feet away. The rider swung a boot over the seat and dismounted with the ease of someone completely in control. He was tall, broad, the kind of man who filled a space just by standing in it. Tattoos snaked up his arms, disappearing under his cut, and his face carried the weathered confidence of someone who never lost. Travis Reaper Kane. "Well, well," he said, taking a slow step forward. His eyes flicked to the wheelchair, the dogs, then back to Sarah. A smirk curled his lips. "What do we have here?" Sarah didn't look up. She kept her focus on the fuel pump, the rhythmic click of the gas trickling into the tank, the only sound between them. Reaper let out a slow, amused chuckle. "A little lost, sweetheart?" Behind him, the other bikers began fanning out, moving in what seemed like casual patterns. But Sarah saw it immediately. The way they positioned themselves near the van, near the exits. The way they kept their hands loose, ready. It was practiced. Intentional. Not just a gang, ex-military. She exhaled through her nose, slow and steady. Reaper took another step closer. "You don't talk much, do you?" Sarah finally turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze for the first time. "I talk when there's something worth saying." Reaper's smirk deepened. He glanced at his men, letting out a small laugh, like he couldn't believe she had the nerve. "I like her," he said. "She's got some bite." One of the bikers, a heavy-set man with a shaved head and a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward. His eyes landed on the van. "Nice ride," he commented, tapping his knuckles lightly against the metal. "Custom job?" Sarah's jaw tightened just slightly. Scar wasn't just making conversation. He was assessing. He recognized something in the van. Maybe the reinforced frame, maybe the subtle military-grade modifications. He wasn't just looking at a wheelchair-accessible vehicle. He was looking at something built for more than just convenience. Scar took another step. "Yeah, but where's that taking you?" Ranger's ears flicked. Echo lifted his head just slightly, barely noticeable to anyone who wasn't paying attention. Sarah turned off the pump, set the nozzle back into place, and faced them fully for the first time. "It gets me where I need to go." Scar tilted his head. "Yeah? And where's that?" Sarah didn't answer. She could feel the shift in the air now. That moment before a fight, before someone made the first move. The game was already in play. They had already decided she was a target. They just hadn't figured out how hard that target was going to hit back, and soon they were going to find out. The hard way. Sarah could feel the shift in the air. The subtle changes, the way the bikers' postures adjusted, not quite aggressive, but no longer casual. The way their eyes darted toward each other, unspoken messages passing between them. They weren't just standing around, they were positioning. They spread out, forming a loose semicircle around her. To an outsider, it might have seemed harmless, maybe even lazy. But Sarah wasn't an outsider. They were testing her, like predators. Reaper crouched slightly, his hands resting on his knees as he studied Ranger and Echo. "Nice dogs," he murmured. "Bet they fetch real good." His men chuckled, low and knowing. Sarah exhaled through her nose, steady even. "They do a little more than that." Reaper's grin widened just a little, but his eyes darkened. "Is that so?" A single bike pulled up closest to Sarah, stopping just a few feet away. The rider swung a boot over the seat and dismounted with the ease of someone completely in control. He was tall, broad, the kind of man who filled a space just by standing in it. Tattoos snaked up his arms, disappearing under his cut, and his face carried the weathered confidence of someone who never lost. Travis Reaper Kane. "Well, well," he said, taking a slow step forward. His eyes flicked to the wheelchair, the dogs, then back to Sarah. A smirk curled his lips. "What do we have here?" Sarah didn't look up. She kept her focus on the fuel pump, the rhythmic click of the gas trickling into the tank, the only sound between them. Reaper let out a slow, amused chuckle. "A little lost, sweetheart?" Behind him, the other bikers began fanning out, moving in what seemed like casual patterns. But Sarah saw it immediately. The way they positioned themselves near the van, near the exits. The way they kept their hands loose, ready. It was practiced, intentional, not just a gang ex-military. She exhaled through her nose, slow and steady. Reaper took another step closer. "You don't talk much, do you?" Sarah finally turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze for the first time. "I talk when there's something worth saying." Reaper's smirk deepened. He glanced at his men, letting out a small laugh like he couldn't believe she had the nerve. "I like her," he said. "She's got some bite." One of the bikers, a heavy-set man with a shaved head and a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward. His eyes landed on the van. "Nice ride," he commented, tapping his knuckles lightly against the metal. "Custom job?" Sarah's jaw tightened just slightly. Scar wasn't just making conversation. He was assessing. He recognized something in the van. Maybe the reinforced frame, maybe the subtle military-grade modifications. He wasn't just looking at a wheelchair-accessible vehicle. He was looking at something built for more than just convenience. Scar took another step. "Yeah, but where's that taking you?" Ranger's ears flicked. Echo lifted his head just slightly, barely noticeable to anyone who wasn't paying attention. Sarah turned off the pump, set the nozzle back into place, and faced them fully for, the first time. "It gets me where I need to go." Scar tilted his head. "Yeah? And where's that?" Sarah didn't answer. She could feel the shift in the air now. That moment before a fight, before someone made the first move. The game was already in play. They had already decided she was a target. They just hadn't figured out how hard that target was going to hit back. And soon, they were going to find out. The hard way. Sarah could feel the shift in the air, the subtle changes, the way the bikers' postures adjusted. Not quite aggressive, but no longer casual. The way their eyes darted toward each other, unspoken messages passing between them. They weren't just standing around. They were positioning. They spread out, forming a loose semicircle around her. To an outsider, it might have seemed harmless, maybe even lazy. But Sarah wasn't an outsider. They were testing her, like predators. Reaper crouched slightly, his hands resting on his knees as he studied Ranger and Echo. "Nice dogs," he murmured. "Bet they fetch real good." His men chuckled, low and knowing. Sarah exhaled through her nose, steady even. "They do a little more than that." Reaper's grin widened just a little, but his eyes darkened. "Is that so?" Behind the counter inside the gas station, Murphy tensed. He wasn't the type to get spooked easy. He'd seen plenty in his years running this place. Tough guys, criminals, bad men looking for trouble. But there was something about this moment. The quiet way it was unfolding, that put his instincts on edge. Outside, one of the bikers peeled away from the group. A man with a thick beard and a flame tattoo creeping up the side of his neck. Blaze. He sauntered toward Sarah's van, dragging, his fingers lazily across the metal. "Custom setup?" he asked, tapping his knuckles against the side. "Must have cost a pretty penny." Sarah's fingers curled against the armrest of her wheelchair. The low thump of his hand against the van's reinforced door sent a ripple of unease through her. He wasn't just testing her. He was trying to see if she'd react. She did, but not in the way he expected. "Step away from my vehicle." Her voice was quiet. Too quiet. And just like that, the laughter died down. Because that wasn't the voice of a frightened woman. That wasn't a plea. It was a command. Blaze hesitated just for a second. Just long enough. Sarah saw the moment realization crept in, the way something in the back of his mind whispered that they might have miscalculated. Reaper. Turned his head slightly, watching her. He'd heard it too. Something about her was off. She wasn't giving them what they wanted: fear, uncertainty, panic. Instead, she sat there completely still, waiting. The air had thickened now, charged with something electric, a silent standoff, where the wrong move could set everything off. Then the radio crackled inside the gas station. Murphy barely had time to react before a voice, distant, garbled but clear enough, filled the air. Repeat. Confirmed sightings of iron vultures moving toward State Route 19. Be advised, these men are considered armed and dangerous. Silence, a beat. Murphy's eyes flicked to Sarah. He knew she'd heard it. So had they. Reaper let out a slow, deliberate chuckle. He flexed his fingers, the sound of knuckles cracking sharp in the night air. Well now, he mused, tilting his head. That's just bad timing, huh? The bikers moved closer. Their casual stance was gone, replaced with something heavier, something intentional. They weren't just looking to intimidate anymore. Sarah knew what was coming. They thought they had her outnumbered. They thought the wheelchair made her weak. They thought wrong. Her fingers curled slightly around the armrest. A slow inhale, a measured exhale, then just 2 words. Ranger. Echo. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but that was all it took. The shift in the dogs was instant. 1 second, they were statues, calm, obedient service animals. The next, predators. Ranger's deep, guttural growl rumbled through the night air, a low vibration that sent a primal warning through the spines of every man standing too close. Echo lowered his head, his muscles coiled like a loaded spring. The bikers faltered. Blaze, still standing by the van, took a half step back. Instinct. He didn't even realize he was doing it. Reaper. He wasn't laughing anymore. Whoa now, he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. No need to get all riled up. Sarah tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. That's funny. She tapped a small, hidden switch on her wheelchair's armrest. I was about to say the same thing. A soft beep sounded. From inside the van, something clicked. A mechanical whir filled the silence. Blaze turned just in time to see the van's security mode engage. Steel panels sliding into place over the windows, a small tactical drone activating. On the roof, the bikers tensed. The hell is this? Blaze demanded, his voice sharp now. Sarah? She just smiled. Like I said. She exhaled, her voice even. They do a little more than fetch. Ranger lunged first, a flash of teeth, a blur of motion. Blaze didn't even have time to scream before 200 pounds of trained muscle slammed into him, knocking him to the ground. Echo was next. A split second later, another biker found himself on his back. Echo's powerful jaws locked around his wrist, not breaking it, just holding. A warning. The rest of the bikers scrambled. Some reached for their weapons. Sarah exhaled sharply. I wouldn't do that. The words cut through the night, cold and certain. Reaper froze. Because suddenly, Murphy wasn't behind the counter anymore. He was standing at the gas station entrance, and in his hands, a shotgun. The old man's stance was steady, his finger resting near the trigger, his expression one of pure disgust. You boys, Murphy muttered, shaking his head slowly, just made the worst mistake of your lives. The air felt like it. Might snap from the tension. No one moved. Ranger and Echo remained locked in position, motionless but ready. The bikers? They weren't laughing anymore. Blaze was still on the ground, Ranger's teeth just inches from his throat. The other man whimpered as Echo held him firm, his powerful jaws around his wrist. Murphy didn't lower the shotgun, and Reaper, he wasn't panicking, no fear, just a smirk. That was what made Sarah's stomach tighten. He knew something she didn't. Reaper slowly rolled his shoulders, glancing around at the situation. Then he let out a low chuckle. "Lady," he drawled, shaking his head. "You really don't know what you just stepped into." Sarah narrowed her eyes. "Enlighten me." Reaper's smirk deepened. He didn't answer right away. Instead, his gaze shifted, looking over his shoulder toward the highway. That's when Sarah heard it. A faint hum in the distance. A steady, familiar sound. An approaching engine, a police cruiser. Murphy cursed under his breath. Sarah didn't move, didn't flinch. She just watched as the cruiser rolled into the station, dust kicking up behind it, the flashing lights off, a quiet arrival. A deliberate one. The driver's side door opened, and out stepped Deputy Mark Russell. The man was built like a slab of stone, broad shoulders, thick arms, the slow, deliberate walk of someone who didn't hurry for anyone. His hand rested casually on his holster, but his eyes, they weren't on the bikers. They were on Sarah. She knew right then. This wasn't just some random encounter. This wasn't just a gang causing trouble. This went deeper, much deeper. Russell stopped a few feet away, his face unreadable. "Ma'am," he drawled, "we got a problem here." Sarah didn't answer immediately because she was watching him, the way his fingers twitched. Just slightly, near his holster. The way Reaper relaxed just a fraction when he arrived. The way Murphy muttered under his breath, just low enough that only she could hear. They own him. And there it was. Sarah exhaled slowly, tilting her head. "The question isn't whether we have a problem," she said finally, locking eyes with Russell. "The question is, how many people are on it?" Russell's fingers twitched again, and that's when Sarah knew. She wasn't just fighting bikers tonight, she was about to go to war. The desert air was heavy, thick with something unspoken, something dangerous. Sarah could feel it, the way the moment had shifted. This wasn't just about a group of bikers looking for trouble. This was bigger. Reaper's smirk grew, slow and deliberate. He was enjoying this. "See, lady, you ain't just dealing with some bikers trying to have a little fun." His voice was smooth, practiced, the kind of voice that had convinced plenty of people to look the other way. "You're standing in the middle of something bigger." Sarah's grip on her wheelchair's controls tightened. She didn't like games. "Enlighten me," Reaper chuckled. Not rushed, not nervous, like a man who already knew how this was going to end. He glanced at Deputy Russell. "Well now, that depends." He turned back toward Sarah, tilting his head. "Mark, you want to explain, or should I?" Russell exhaled slowly, tilted his head just slightly. Then he spoke. "Step out of this, Monroe." His voice was steady, unreadable. "I'm giving you a chance." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "A chance?" Russell adjusted his stance. "Turn your van around. Keep driving. Forget you ever saw anything." Murphy scoffed from the gas station doorway, his shotgun still trained on the bikers. "So that's how it is, huh?" His voice was edged with something bitter, something that had been building for a long time. "You're in on it." Russell didn't flinch. "You're too old for this fight, Murphy." Murphy's jaw clenched. "Yeah?" His voice dropped, rough and certain. "Funny. Last time I checked, I still knew how to pull a trigger." Sarah's mind was already working, connecting the dots. A notorious biker gang tearing up a small town, a dirty cop showing up at just the right moment, and the way Reaper spoke. Like he wasn't just another outlaw, like he was part of something bigger. Sarah's voice came sharp and clean. "Drugs?" she guessed. "Weapons? Or something worse?" Reaper's smirk didn't fade. Not right away. But something changed, a flicker in his eyes. A shift in the weight of his stance. "You ask a lot of questions for someone sitting in a wheelchair," he said, his voice low. Sarah's lips twitched in something almost resembling amusement. And you're avoiding a lot of answers for someone who's about to lose. Reaper's smirk disappeared. Monroe. Russell's voice dropped lower now, firm, edged with warning. Last chance. Walk away. Sarah exhaled once, slow. Then, without hesitation, she gave the command. Ranger. Echo. Engage. The effect was instant. Ranger launched first, a blur of muscle and instinct, his powerful jaws locked onto Russell's gun arm before he could even pull his weapon. The deputy let out a shocked grunt, his knees buckling as the weight of the dog sent him staggering back. Echo struck next. The second biker didn't even have time to react. 1 second he was reaching for his gun. The next, he was flat on his back. Echo's snarl filled the air, his teeth inches from the man's face. The rest of Reaper's men panicked. Some froze. Some reached for their weapons. Bad mistake. Murphy fired first. The shotgun's roar shattered the night, the blast tearing into the tires of one of the bikes, sending it skidding and crashing onto the pavement. Murphy pumped the shotgun, eyes cold. You boys should have stayed home tonight. Reaper moved. Fast, too fast for a man his size. Sarah saw the shift in his shoulders first, the way his weight adjusted before the lunge. But she was faster. As he lunged for her, she twisted in her wheelchair, and her arm came up, the stun baton, hidden in her sleeve, crackled to life. She drove it straight into his side. 1,000 volts. Reaper's body locked up instantly. A strangled sound escaped his throat as his knees buckled, his frame convulsing before he collapsed, twitching. His men? They were done. Those who weren't already on the ground were scrambling, tripping over each other, desperate to get to their bikes. Russell? He lay motionless, his service pistol knocked from his grip. Ranger stood over him now, lips peeled back in a silent warning. Sarah breathed out, slow, even, certain. Told you. Her gaze swept across the wreckage, the bodies on the ground, the bikers still gasping for breath. She leaned forward just slightly. Wrong target. Murphy stepped forward, shotgun still firm in his grip, eyes scanning the wreckage. The bikers were down, their weapons scattered, their leader barely conscious on the pavement. The fight was over, but the war, not even close. What? Now? Murphy muttered. Sarah glanced down at Deputy Russell. He was struggling to sit up, his face twisted with fury and pain. This, he groaned, eyes locking onto her, isn't over. Sarah tilted her head slightly. No. Her voice was quiet, steady. It's not. And then, sirens. A new set of headlights cut through the darkness. SUVs, not police cruisers. Something else. Murphy cursed under his breath. Friends of yours? Sarah didn't answer, because she recognized those vehicles. Federal agents. The SUVs. Screeched to a stop. Doors burst open. Men in tactical gear spilled out like a well-trained wave, rifles raised, then moving with the kind of authority that only came with absolute control. A tall man in a crisp suit stepped forward. His gaze went straight to Sarah. Sarah Monroe. Sarah kept her stance neutral. Who's asking? The man almost smiled. Agent Dawson, FBI. Her eyes flicked toward the fallen bikers now groaning on the ground. Took your time. Dawson's sharp gaze swept over the scene, calculating. Looks like you had things handled. Sarah didn't respond. She just watched. Dawson sighed. We've been building a case on these guys for months. Trafficking, weapons smuggling. We were hoping to get more out of them before moving in. Sarah's brow lifted. Well, she said dryly. Sorry to ruin your plan. Dawson smirked. No. He glanced at Reaper being hauled to his feet, cuffed and furious. You did us a favor. The remaining agents worked quickly, efficiently. Reaper groaned, his wrists locked behind him. He didn't look at Sarah. He looked straight at Dawson. You're making a mistake. Dawson didn't even blink. Yeah, he said flatly. I'll let the judge figure that out. Sarah finally turned to Murphy. You gonna be okay here? Murphy snorted. Lady, I've seen worse than a couple of idiots with motorcycles. Sarah nodded. She turned to Ranger and Echo. Ranger. Echo. The dogs immediately fell into position at her side, silent, disciplined. Dawson watched them closely. Those are some damn fine dogs. Sarah smirked. Yeah, they are. She turned toward her van. The driver's seat felt familiar beneath her, comfortable, like home. It was time to go. Dawson stepped forward. Where will you go now? Sarah didn't answer right away. Her gaze drifted out toward the open road. Endless possibilities, new battles waiting, then, finally, she looked back at him. Wherever I'm needed. And with that, she drove off into the night. Sometimes the ones who seem the weakest are the ones you should fear the most. They blend in. They go unnoticed until the moment comes, and they strike. Sarah Monroe wasn't just a veteran. She was a survivor. She was a warrior. And tonight, she reminded the world exactly what that meant. Not with words, not with threats, with action. She didn't hesitate. She didn't back down. She calculated. She adapted. And when the time came, she fought. Because some fights come looking for you. And when that happens, you have two choices: stand your ground or let someone else decide your fate. But now I have a question for you. If you were in Sarah's shoes, would you have handled things differently? Would you have? Option number 1, let things play out, hoping for the best. Option number 2, take control and fight back just like she did. Or maybe you have another approach. Drop your answers in the comments below. And before you go, hit that like button, subscribe, share this video so we can keep bringing you more stories like this. Because trust me, this was just the beginning. Until next time, stay sharp, stay ready,